Welcome to You Brew Kombucha. Today we're going to talk about what to do if you've taken a break from brewing kombucha and how to get back into brewing kombucha. So if you've taken a break from brewing kombucha for a while and want to get back into it, here are a few tips that you can take to make sure that you're starting your next batch on the right foot. So if you have a SCOBY hotel and decided to basically keep all of your starter tea and all of your pellicles or your SCOBYs in a vessel just to kind of have a place to store them while you're on this break, then the first thing that I would do is just take a look at the SCOBY hotel and make sure that the top of the liquid and the top layer of the pellicle doesn't show any signs of mold. So if you see any like very bright vivid colors, whether it's green or orange or black, that's a bad sign that the batch is likely contaminated and you might have to throw your entire SCOBY hotel away. Actually, you definitely have to throw your whole SCOBY hotel away if there's mold. So just do a quick inspection to make sure that it's still healthy. If it's not healthy, you're gonna need to just purchase a new pellicle and some starter tea from a good online source. And if you want some recommendations, I share some links to my favorite sources of SCOBYs on my website, youbrewkombucha.com. But assuming that the SCOBY hotel is healthy, you're looking at the top layer of the SCOBY and there isn't any signs of mold, then the next thing I would do is take a look at it and see if the top layer has dried out at all. If it's dry and craggy and looks like the surface of the moon, then I would recommend just peeling that top dry layer off and discarding it, because it's better to just use one of the layers down below that has been submerged in the actual starter tea liquid. Now, as you can see in this SCOBY hotel, there's actually a good amount of liquid left over. It's been about 3 to 4 months since I last fed this SCOBY hotel. And by feeding, that just means that I added some room temperature sweet black tea to it to make sure that it has enough, basically a nutrition source to feed off of. So the last time I poured some sweet black tea into this SCOBY hotel was 3 to 4 months ago, and there's actually still a good amount of liquid in here. This liquid is going to be really acidic at this point because I haven't touched it in months. It's continued to ferment at room temperature, and so that pH has continued to go down as fermentation has continued to happen. This is actually really perfect strong starter tea to start brewing your next batch of kombucha. If your SCOBY hotel is in a similar state where you've got a good amount of liquid, go ahead and just follow my recipe for brewing 1 gallon batch of homemade kombucha to get that first fermentation going. I usually recommend using 2 cups of really strong starter tea to kickstart every new batch of kombucha for first fermentation. So if there's enough liquid in your SCOBY hotel to get right back at it and just brew a whole gallon of kombucha, then you're good to go. All you have to do is just extract that 2 cups of liquid from the SCOBY hotel, peel one of these pellicles off, throw it in your new batch, and you're good to go. If, however, you find that there isn't really much liquid, say it's evaporated or you haven't touched it in about a year or so, and there just isn't enough liquid in the SCOBY hotel, what I would first do is just pour all of that liquid out and measure how much liquid is there, because all of my kombucha recipes are actually scalable. So if I recommend 2 cups of strong starter tea to brew 1 gallon of kombucha, and you find that you only have, say, a half a cup of starter tea, just scale the recipe down. So if you only have a half a cup of starter tea, that would make for a quart of kombucha. So instead of brewing a full gallon, just take the recipe that I share on my website or in these other YouTube videos. I'll link them down in the description box below. But just take that recipe and just scale it down to accommodate for the actual volume of starter tea that you have in your SCOBY hotel. And then you can slowly build that up. So if, for example, you only had half a cup of starter tea, so you brewed a quart of kombucha. After that quart of kombucha has completed its first fermentation after a week or 2, then now you can use that liquid as starter tea to get the next batch of kombucha brewing. So you can slowly scale up your kombucha production so that even if you started out with a small amount of starter tea to begin with, as you get back into the fermentation process and start brewing more batches of kombucha, you'll basically just increase the amount of starter tea that you have to brew the following batches of kombucha with. Now, if you've actually kept your SCOBY hotel in the refrigerator for whatever reason, and I'll just remind you that it's definitely not necessary to store your SCOBY hotel in the refrigerator because it does just fine at room temperature, and it actually lessens the likelihood of mold if you keep all of your brew vessels at room temperature as opposed to in a colder temperature. But if you did keep your SCOBY hotel in the refrigerator, the first thing that I would do is just inspect for mold. Always inspect for mold, because especially if any part of the pellicle is extending outside of the acidic liquid, the possibility of mold increases, even though the actual liquid in the vessel is very acidic and not a hospitable environment to harmful pathogens. So this liquid is actually inhospitable to harmful pathogens because it's acidic. So the longer the fermentation happens, the more pellicles you put in here, the more acidic it is, the lower the pH, the less likely it will grow mold, because mold just can't handle that type of acidic environment. It's essentially like a vinegar. Kombucha is a vinegar ferment. If you put this in the refrigerator, it likely won't grow mold, but if the pellicle happens to be poking outside of that acidic liquid and it happens to dry out, and say you kept it in the fridge next to a block of moldy cheese, it's possible that there could be some cross-contamination in there, which is another reason why I prefer to not keep it in the refrigerator. Now, if you did happen to keep it in the fridge and say you kept a lid on it, say all of the pellicles were completely submerged and it looks fine and no mold, good amount of starter tea in there, what I would recommend at that point is just bringing it out to room temperature and letting it reacclimate to that higher, warmer room temperature for a few days before starting to brew a batch of kombucha with it. And that's just extra insurance, because cold temperatures inhibit fermentation, and so a lot of that active live bacteria and yeast, while they aren't dead, they could go into a state of dormancy, and essentially the rate of fermentation is very slow. So if you were to take that really cold liquid from the SCOBY hotel in the refrigerator and immediately start brewing a new batch of kombucha with it, that increases the likelihood of mold growing in that new fresh batch of kombucha, because not only are you basically putting possibly dormant cultures into a fresh batch of kombucha, but you've now diluted that acidic starter tea with nearly a gallon of fresh sweet tea. So you're basically making the sleeping cultures work extra hard to ferment that volume of liquid. And the longer it takes for that fermentation to happen, the more likely it is that batch could grow mold, because you want to try to get that pH of the sweet tea as low as quickly as possible to kickstart that fermentation. So just as an extra precaution, if you did keep your SCOBY hotel in the fridge and it all checks out and it all looks good and you've got a good amount of liquid in there, just let it hang out at room temperature for maybe 3 to 4 days. And once it's reacclimated to that warmer temperature, then you can go ahead and follow my recipe to brew a gallon of kombucha using that liquid. The last scenario is actually a really simple one, and it's if you didn't create a SCOBY hotel at all, if you don't have a SCOBY hotel or you just didn't use it for this particular break, but you had a batch of kombucha that you had the intention to drink, but life got in the way, you forgot about it, now it's a few months later, what do? This is actually really simple as well, because what you've basically just done is in effect created a SCOBY hotel. That's actually what happened with this batch. I brewed this batch of kombucha a few months ago with the full intention of letting it complete its first fermentation, bottling it, flavoring it, drinking it, but life got in the way and a couple of months have passed and I still have not bottled it. And at this point, it's been fermenting for a couple of months, and so now it's very acidic, and it's actually more acidic than my taste preferences. So what I can do with this is basically just use this super acidic kombucha as starter tea to make a fresh batch of kombucha. All I have to do is just use this liquid as starter tea for my basic 1 gallon batch of first fermentation kombucha, and I'm good to go. And the rest of this liquid, I can just, save it and use it as a SCOBY hotel, keep my extra pellicles in here, or if if you want to actually drink this, there's nothing wrong with it. It's drinkable. It's just very sour, drinking vinegar. And so if you wanted to drink this, what you could do is dilute it with some fresh sweet tea, like just make a batch of black tea and use that as a dilution, and it's still very drinkable. Or you can dilute it with some sweet fresh fruit juice. So it definitely does not have to go to waste. It has not spoiled. The more acidic the liquid is, the better it is, and the more bacteria there is in that liquid to actually kickstart the fermentation for future batches of kombucha. So it's actually a really good thing if it's acidic. So I hope that's helpful. I know there are a few different scenarios, but what I love about kombucha is that it's a really flexible ferment. So even if you just, have a bunch of brew vessels that you left in a corner and forgot about for several months, they'll just be waiting there and continuing ferment until you're ready to come back and get brewing again. So I hope this was helpful. If you have any questions, drop me a comment. You can find a bunch more resources on my YouTube channel and at youbrewkombucha.com. And if you haven't already checked out the Kombucha Crafter's logbook, I actually have a journal and a logbook with more tips and tricks and troubleshooting, as well as some charts and journal pages that you can actually use to log and document your brews to keep yourself on track and remind yourself of whether it's the last time you fed your SCOBY hotel or when you started brewing a batch. And so definitely check that out if you haven't already. And I hope this was helpful. Happy brewing!